Welcome to the Exceptional Sales Leader Podcast with Darren Mitchell. If you're a sales leader looking to take your leadership to a whole new level, then this is the podcast for you. We'll be exploring tips, techniques, and strategies to help you take your leadership to the exceptional level and allow you to enjoy more money, more meaning, and better sales results. Welcome to the Exceptional Sales Leader Podcast. Darren Mitchell here on what is a beautiful winter's day here in Melbourne. And today I've got the absolute pleasure of welcoming into the podcast a man from Darius Rucker country, Charleston, South Carolina, the States, Mr. Jonathan Gardner. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for the warm intro and for the opportunity to chat with you and your listeners.
Thank you. And just before we press record, I was saying that we're now connected on LinkedIn, and I happened to notice that you're from Charleston. And the first thing that popped into my mind was Darius Rucker. And if people are not listening to this, not knowing who he is, he's the lead singer of Hootie and the Blowfish, one of my most famous and most favorite bands. And he's now a country and western singer. So you're in the same town, potentially.
I sure am. And as a matter of fact, when I was in university in my undergraduate years, Hootie and the Blowfish were just becoming famous. And so my fraternity couldn't afford it by itself my freshman year. But by the time the senior year came around, there would take 5 organizations to pitch in, and maybe we could afford them once a year. Their popularity went through the roof, and the rest is history. And I'd like to say I played a bit part by putting in my $10 to help them along.
Absolutely. Just and it's just, hey, there's probably some parallels there in terms of longevity around sales and sales leadership as well, staying in the game, because hey, you've got to have talent. B, you've got to stay in the game, and C, if you can put those two together, then anything's possible. So, Jonathan, great to have you on the podcast. You are the principal and founder of Gardner Group Executive Advisory, which is a big term, but essentially you've got a very, very interesting and highly successful background in strategic sourcing, supply chain, and now you help clients and businesses buy better and sell better. So this is going to be a fascinating conversation because we're going to look at it both from a seller's perspective and a buyer's perspective, and hopefully bring out for the listeners some nuggets of gold. Love for you to just give us a bit of a background in terms of what you've achieved, because I know you've worked for some big organizations. And what has actually led you to start the consultancy and the advisory organization that you now run?
Thank you for the opportunity to share a bit of background. When I was younger, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I had this vision of being an international deal maker. And so as I was wrapping up graduate school, so a law degree and international MBA, I had a couple of opportunities, but General Motors, the giant automotive company, had a rotation program where they took recent MBA hires and they cycled us through a number of different disciplines in supply chain, which included obviously strategic sourcing, but manufacturing, logistics, crisis resolution, et cetera. But the way I'm wired and my interest always came back to architecting supply chains, doing the deals necessary, establishing the commercial relationships necessary to really take product from dirt to dumpster, if you will, and understand how and where we might extract value for our company along the way. And so opportunities took me from General Motors to Dell Computers down in Austin, Texas. Then I spent almost a decade up at Starbucks in Seattle, Washington. And then the universe conspired to present some family reasons as well as a professional opportunity for me to join Albertsons grocery store in the beautiful city of Boise, Idaho. I wasn't on the same page with what that organization needed to look like. So I moved on, and it was fine because the headhunters were still ringing. And then COVID hit. And I went, oh, not so brilliant. But I decided to make a lemonade out of lemons. And when I started networking with Real Intent, I called some of the sales guys that I'd worked with as an executive. Whoops, sorry. I just got a random bit of.
I'm still with you.
Hang on, so I got a random bit of.
That's not Darius Rucker coming into your headphones, is it?
No, I wish it were. These headphones have Bluetooth, so I think my wife is Anyway, apologies for.
Hey, just so you know, this and when I said to you before the podcast, it's we just riff it and we riff it. So that
Apologies.
was your
So
wife coming to your ears saying, "Hey, get off this podcast. It's time for dinner."
yeah, exactly. So apologies for that. This is the glory of working from home, I suppose. So anyway, I was saying life served me lemons. I decided to make lemonade. And when I started, networking with real intent, the first people I started to call were those that I'd worked through really tough situations with, tended to be sales executives. And one of them said, "Hey, we've got a deal cooking with a customer that you know well. Can you help us behind the curtain?" It was private equity owned. Clearly, the PE guys want a long duration, a floor, hard commitments, the ability to manage price, to pass through inflation, all the normal stuff. Well, I helped them get that done. And I made a couple of bucks on that situation, but that was less important. What I gained out of that is, man, being on the revenue generating side is a lot of fun. Is when on the procurement side, it's a lot of it's cost reduction, which is good value for your company, but is value destructive for the people on the other side of the table. So anyway,
Mm.
that one situation, which turned out exceptionally well, and that client is still a client, my biggest client, as a matter of fact. But that helped me realize, well, I've got something to give to the world that's really helpful, and that's to help all these strikers out there, salespeople, learn how to put the ball in the net with more frequency. And think of me as a career. Think of me as Paolo Maldini or maybe Alessandro Nesta in my dreams, teaching those strikers what the defenders are going to do next.
Mm.
I know what the next 10 moves are because I've taught the teams, I've hired them, promoted them, fired them, trained them, you name it. So I know what those next few moves are going to be. And I'm just having really the time of my life on this front. So no, I didn't get into this boutique consultancy as part of a 5-year plan. Life happened, but I landed on my feet. Here we are, and I'm getting to talk to the great Darren Mitchell. So this is fantastic.
Well, the great Darren Mitchell actually is a photographer in the UK. But anyway, I often get emails from clients of his or potential clients asking about photography. But hey, I'll take the feedback. Greatly appreciated. So what's really intriguing about that, Jonathan, is you've had an esteemed career in procurement or strategic sourcing. So you would have learned all the tactics, the mindset games, the strategies that uh, organizations and sales teams deploy. And you would have also had your own defensive strategies and, dare I say, offensive strategies in order to get the best possible deal you can for your organization as well. Just before we press record, we were just having a conversation about how salespeople tend to roll over pretty quickly, and sometimes too early in the sales process. Can you just talk about that? Because we want to explore some of the myths around big deals and some ideas that salespeople and sales leaders can use to, I guess, create better win-win outcomes for their business, but also their customers. But why do you think it is that, in your experience, a lot of salespeople and sales teams are too eager to please?
I think there are a couple of things. One is they're eager to please. Two, compensation systems, in my experience, typically reward revenue rather than profit. And then the third is there's a fear factor. They don't know what they don't know, and whether it's a trick that a buyer plays or a buyer is simply not responsive, uh, salespeople get incredibly nervous at the lack of response. We in procurement expect a note back, an email back from you the same day, but I might ghost you and go quiet for a month. Meanwhile, the salesperson is going down some rabbit hole in their own mind of, oh my gosh, they're developing, a new widget with my competitor. Right? No, they're just rude. That they're just not getting back to you. And so there's it's true. There's a combination of things. And when a big event like an RFP is launched, I think the tendency of the sales organization, and if it's a big customer and say a smaller supplier, that sales team is the CEO, FO, as well as head of sales, and the quota carrying sales jockey, him or herself.
Yeah.
There just becomes this pressure to win the business or not lose the business, do whatever it takes to keep the business. And they don't know themselves. their competitors or their customers well enough to really understand what their bargaining power is, how to increase it, and how to exploit it.
Yeah.
It's easy to say, and there's a lot behind that. But those are the reasons I think, and that I said in our pre-podcast chat, that that I see salespeople roll over too quickly, too easily.
So when you think about that, because I know I like talking about this concept of the balance of power and where the balance of power sits. And
Yes.
if you look at an RFP, for example, unless you are the incumbent supplier to that particular organization, then at least mentally or psychologically, the balance of power potentially sits with the customer. So we will do whatever we possibly can to try and entice, ethically manipulate, ethically convince this customer, persuade them that we're the best solution for their problem. Um, when we talk about the balance of power, do you think it's a case of organizations trying to convince a like a General Motors or a Starbucks that we have the best solution? And what differentiates, do you think, the great sales teams or the great organizations that you've dealt with from the ones that perhaps do roll over too quickly? And by that I mean the ones that are focused on the actual solution or the problem they're trying to solve, versus trying to flog your product and their product and make it all about themselves.
Great question with a lot of layers in there. The first layer that I want to strip out is, you're right. When you're not the incumbent, when you're trying to break into a situation, you may not have, certainly seem that you don't have any of the power, because typically the textbook answer is that the leverage or the bargaining power sits with the person for whom the status quo is okay. So let's go to the next layer. If you allow the procurement team, or through your lack of your own imagination, if you let the conversation with procurement be about money, you're going to have a hard time, and you probably will have to roll over. I would imagine that you coach your clients and your podcast listeners to make it a value sale, to make the proposition about far more than just money. That there's got to be more to it, and in some
Yeah.
cases it's lead time, minimum order quantity. In other cases, it's true R&D. But the fact of the matter is, you've got to expand the conversation in terms of the subject that you're talking about, and you also need to expand who you're talking to.
Yeah. Yeah. It's an interesting dynamic because and I'm just looking at this from a sales leadership perspective when I was in corporate, and the conversations that we would have to have with our sales teams, because our senior leaders were saying literally that, do whatever it takes to get the deal. Now, you mentioned before ghosting, and when we look at negotiating styles, one of the negotiating styles that many organizations use is the avoidance strategy. Now, the avoidance strategy is not necessarily just ignoring you, but it's actually delaying response times. It's actually psychologically playing a little bit of mental warfare to think, okay, we know that the end of the month is creeping up and the end of the quarter is creeping up, so we're just going to go a little bit silent to put some perceived pressure onto the organization, and they will come forth and probably give us a better deal. How much of this do you think, and certainly thinking about your advisory role now, how important is it for a sales team to have senior executive engagement that is part of the entire flow of the sales process, rather than just coming in at the point end or negotiations end, in terms of getting a good deal?
Think it's critical for the management team to stay aligned throughout the process. And that's whether you're buying or selling, frankly. Because if you wait till the end for the big guy or gal or a stakeholder to drop in, chances are the context is going to be lost, and the deal will come down to what you can put in a spreadsheet, i.e., money. And so that's one way, just kind of the dynamic of the big voice that drops at the end. The other reason, and I'm a big believer in the life cycle of a deal, in which the negotiation takes place at the very end. It's like the last 10% of, so to speak. And so what I like to do as a leader of an organization, and now as a consultant, is to make sure that we are keeping people informed throughout, that we make sure We know our own power map in terms of what can manufacturing do, logistics deliver, what will the CFO agree to from a price standpoint, et cetera, et cetera. You bring those folks along so that your deal making team is empowered within guardrails. And I find that that constant touch point, within guardrails enables the people that are in contact with your customer on a constant basis to make comments and influence gently along the way, and with a constant drip, drip, drip of information and comments, as opposed to let's wait till the end, bring in the big guns, and they'll solve our problems for us. It just works better in industrial sales when you play the long game.
And with that approach, do you believe that that's what's one of the things that increases and gives you better leverage in terms of bargaining power because of that transparency throughout the process?
It can, if you're using that life cycle, that process to well, you better know your own company going into the process, and frankly, not as many people that should know that do know that. But that process gives you a lot of time to learn about the customer, who can say yes, who can say no at the company, and those aren't the same people usually.
Yeah.
And it also gives you time to research or suss out tidbits about the competition. And so a clever sales team, not just salesperson, but say the technical account manager, even customer fulfillment, if you work it as a team throughout the process, you can learn a lot of information along the way. And it's that gathering and utilization of information that enables a better deal. And if you don't do that homework throughout, then, well, you've just taken more time.
Absolutely. So let's talk then about big organizations and negotiating with big customers, particularly from an RFP perspective. One of my mantras, if you like, that I sort of was brought up in sales is if you didn't know an RFP was coming and it just lands on your desk, your chances of winning that are very, very slim. Right. So um, continuing to build awareness, continuing to have those relationships, networking, doing the partnerships, and if possible, having an input into the RFP is the ideal scenario, because it won't necessarily guarantee you a winning proposition, but it certainly will help build awareness and maybe credibility in the eyes of your customer. Um, when we're talking about negotiating with big customers, what are some of the key tips that we should be aware of that can help us get hopefully a better deal for both parties and not have the balance of power sitting with that big organization? Because I'm sure that in your experience over the last 4 years, you might have been working with organizations who it's almost like the David and Goliath. We want to catch these big fish, but we're actually relatively small in comparison. So whether that's a psychological are we worthy type thing, but what are some tips that we can share with the listeners in relation to negotiating with big companies? And are there any myths that perhaps we can dispel along the way?
You bet. So the first thing I'll mention is you better have a power map. That's
Yeah,
literally who's who in the zoo at the company. And what I work with clients or my own teams is I have a deal planner that can become a term sheet. And when
yeah,
you put those concepts together, you can learn at your customers who inside that organization owns certain aspects of the commercial relationship. Because it's not procurement, or procurement will be the they will represent, but procurement has to go back and check with all of their same counterparts, as the sales team has to go back and check. Can we buy it? What are the terms? What type of inventory? What's the forecast? What are we doing from a marketing, from a promotion standpoint? What does R&D need?
mm,
Quality, you name it. They've got to do all of those things. And so I've just voiced over both PowerSheet and the deal planner there. And so I think a really effective sales team, inclusive of a technical account manager, can uncover who's who in the zoo and what that individual needs to be successful along the way. And with that information, then your ability to influence grows exponentially. Your ability to turn the conversation into more than just money and widgets, with more than just procurement, grows. And when you develop that broader, stickier relationship, then your chances of getting a deal that works for both parties and has and can be sustained over time go way up.
yeah. I love that. And you mentioned the power map, and I don't normally call it the power map, but I get what you're talking about. So for people listening, I'm gonna explain it in my terms and correct me if I'm wrong, and tell me if there's additional things you add to it. But a lot of sales teams are very good at recognizing the formalized hierarchy within the customer organization. And so the power map, what we're talking about is you're taking that, but you're also creating a new or a different hierarchy, which actually has where the influencing lines are, where the balance, where the decision makers are, where the people that might be advocates, detractors, sitting on the fence type people. So you get a very good understanding of the ecosystem of your customer and what the relationships are within that customer that could influence a buying decision in our favor or not. Now, is that right?
Absolutely. Can I give you a
Please.
wonderful tactical example in there? Um, Going back a couple of employers ago, this organization had a network of distribution centers across North America. They could not have two suppliers for the same SKU or the same item in the same distribution center. So if
Okay.
procurement wanted to award business to different suppliers, it had to split off the business awards by distribution center. Now, that constraint of business awards doesn't sit with procurement, it sits with the last mile delivery. And
Mm.
there's an entry into the planning organization, but then you've got logistics and you have some constraints with your ERP systems, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, you tell me, how does your negotiation strategy change if you know that you're essentially bidding on distribution centers instead of some magical ability to peel off arbitrary slices?
Well,
Changes a lot.
it does, and it becomes almost like, as you said before, more tactical because you can no longer be strategic and maybe you don't have volume to work on. You've got to actually now negotiate and influence maybe a distribution manager that's at that particular facility because they're constrained by internal company policy.
They are. And so a distribution manager at the facility might have the voice. I'll tell you who does. And the title changes at different companies. It could be a buyer, it could be a planner, but
Mm.
whoever works with your customer fulfillment team on the customer side,
Yep.
that individual has the ability to place POs with whichever supplier they need to. Now, they'll obviously take the guidance from procurement, but if inventory is low at a distribution center and the strategic supplier or the chosen one can't get it done, they're going to make a change. They're not going to wait and ask how that fits into the strategy. They're going to protect OTIF or service. They're
Mm.
just going to do it. And so that relationship, and typically those folks, with all respect, are some of the lower paid members of the organization that are involved with this conversation.
Yep.
Those are the folks that really make sure that the business happens. And so if you work that angle, a lot can happen for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, question around this. We want our sales teams to be really prepared and know the customer really intimately and build all those relationships so that we put ourselves in a position to at least be favorably considered for an outcome. For people listening to this and they say, yeah, I get the power map stuff, I get the fact we've got to build these relationships, but you don't understand, Jonathan and Darren. I've got customers that just don't give me anything. They don't treat their customers as partners. They simply treat them as or their suppliers as suppliers. They don't have any strategic intent. I can't find out this information. I don't know. I don't know who are the power brokers. I don't know who's influencing who because I can't get any information out of the organization. Um, I guess the question with that is, what's your advice to organizations around whether we choose to bid for this business and whether we're a realistic opportunity to actually make headway in this business? Because people might have a scarcity mindset out there to say, hey, we have this customer, there's an RFP, we can't afford not to put a bid in, but is that good business?
Um, your very last question there is the $64 million question, in that if the customer is showing up in a highly tactical manner, um, at the period of time when both companies should be vetting one another, then you can expect that the best type of ongoing relationship you're going to get is going to be very tactical. So that I would view that situation as a tactical situation. And so, yes, perhaps you do need to participate in the RFP and go for it because this is your one chance. If you make that decision, then I would caution you to be very careful of what you choose to show or promise within that RFP process. And to put it in silly terms, don't offer gold dust for the price of sawdust if that buying organization is showing up in a tactical manner. Give them a widget made out of sawdust, price it at sawdust. And I think that's the old lost leader from the vernacular of 20 or 30 years ago. But just be careful. And so when I say gold dust and sawdust, I mean, if it's purely tactical, don't offer them unlimited trial runs in your plant. Don't offer them a team of 3 product developers to massage their things. Don't give away at that low price a ton of marketing insight. I would say make the buying team aware that you have those things, but give them what they're asking for, which is the price of a widget. I got to tell you, from a buying side, when I see salespeople show up to me, or used to, in a highly tactical way, I might use different words, but I was essentially ask them, "Are you looking for true love or cheap thrills?" I can. We can play it either way, but those are very different propositions.
Yeah.
And so that's what you've got to. That's what I recommend that salespeople ask themselves: how is that buying organization showing up to you? And if they're showing up in a cheap thrills kind of way, realize, okay, then we should reciprocate. Make it clear that true love is available through those services that I mentioned, but you got to play the game. You got to dance in accordance with the music that's being played.
And a key part of that is understanding where does the balance of power actually sit. And I say this to
Yes.
sales teams all the time. You've got to have belief in your product and your service, and you've got to believe that your solution has opportunities to solve many problems in the marketplace. But your role is not to push that solution onto organizations. Your role is to figure out whether there's a problem that needs to be solved and whether that organization wants to solve it or needs to solve it. And so thinking about that, it's trying to get a balance between is there a problem that needs to be solved here, and not actually pushing too much onto the customer, but hopefully creating enough of an ecosystem that there's a level of interest and curiosity there that the customer starts to lean into that conversation, and hopefully the balance of power starts to even up a little bit, because it now becomes more of a partnership and hopefully a value proposition that's going to be of benefit to both organizations rather than a tactical supply customer type sale.
I think that's very well said and excellent advice. And what I would like to do for you in the podcast listeners is frame how that gets organized within the strategic sourcing mindset. The best way, or the best explanation of a sourcing team's reason for being has been the 5 points of purpose. And so I'll go through those from tactical to more esoteric. The first is assure supply. Without parts, nothing else matters.
Yeah.
And a procurement team will get fired first if there are chronic shortages. The next is enhance value. That often shows up as cost reduction, but we say enhance value intentionally because sometimes it's worth paying more for gold dust if you can sell it on to your customer for more, as opposed to cheapening product and going for sawdust. So there's enhanced value and protect margin. In protect margin, therein lies things such as commodity risk management. The third, which is increasingly esoteric, becomes enable growth and innovation. Sometimes a supplier is required to, or a buying organization needs their suppliers to bring innovation, real R&D capabilities to the table. That might be the case. The final one is to protect the brand. And that shows up sometimes as ethical sourcing audits or food safety, or if you're in heavy manufacturing, there will be QS or ISO standards. But the bottom line is the buying organization needs to make sure that that supplier is not going to do something that embarrasses the buying organization. You don't want to have your name in print on the front page of the paper for the wrong reasons.
Yeah.
And the fifth point of purpose, which is point of purpose, which is a bit more esoteric, is to look for shared value alignment. And that's more or less what you were just speaking to. Now, those are the 5 points of purpose as expressed at a job a couple of jobs ago. The key to this is to know that not all categories, not all spend categories or things being sold into these companies need the same emphasis on all 5 points of purpose or any of them at any one given point in time. There may be a category where, for whatever reason, it's all about assuring supply. There may be others where deep alignment around investment in R&D and let's build this greenfield, maybe even do a joint venture together where that's important. So you need to get a sense of across those 5 points of purpose, what is your customer looking for? What is that organization looking for? What are they telling you? What does it say on their website? What do their senior leaders say when they go on Darren Mitchell's podcast? Try to gain some information. And if it's all about widgets and cost and lead time, then you need to play that game. But if there's more to it, as you indicated, as I maybe put some different structure around, that's where some real value and much higher margins live.
And that creates the opportunity to have a much longer, more strategic relationship that
Yeah.
can end up being like a true partnership, right? And those partnerships are very, very hard to break. And potentially there'll be no new RFPs in the foreseeable future. There might be some benchmarking exercises and control and some mutual value conversations. But if you get into that more strategic relationship, it's unlikely that they're going to want to break that because there's value that's being delivered.
You bet. And I smile because there will come a point in time where no matter how good of a supplier you are, you'll be informed of and an RFP will land. That's when it becomes incredibly important that your buying organization and the power map within there truly knows your value, your service record, et cetera, et cetera. And when that RFP lands, keep in mind the anecdote I shared about distribution centers. So think in terms of chunks of business. Keep in mind that any good procurement person worth their salt in a major spend category is going to want to mitigate their own risk by having redundancy in their supply chain, which sometimes redundancy means 2 suppliers or 3. So they're going to have a need for that, but their switching costs are going to be high. And now we're talking on some of the myth busting. If you're the incumbent supplier, keep in mind that it's not as easy as the buyer clicking their heels together or snapping their fingers and getting the rest of the organization to go along with a change of supplier or even introduction of a new one. It's hard. You have to get the heads of R&D and planning and logistics and category, blah, 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 to all agree that they should allocate resources that are currently pursuing their bonusable objectives to reorient to help you as a buyer, achieve your bonusable objective of a cost reduction. And that's not easy. It's not easy for that to happen. So when you're able to make the relationship broad, if you're able to be a leader in service and bring R&D capabilities, then you've really insulated yourself from what I would say a catastrophic loss of business. You are going to get challenged, as you pointed out, but that's the point that I made in there, the myth that I made that procurement has all this power. It's a myth. All my procurement brethren are going to send me hate email after this podcast. But the fact of the matter is they can't just flip a switch in a lot of cases. Now, if you're selling fungible goods or pencils, well, you need to play the price game. But if it's truly a solution sell with more stickiness, you've got more bargaining power than you think you do.
And with that, because I'm sure there's a lot of people listening to this who have got experiences and maybe some really bad experiences dealing with procurement where they felt they were just over a barrel and they had to give away the whole house. And then they brought their senior leadership in, and the senior leader says, well, we had given you our best and final offer, the famous BAFO, but hey, I'm going to just do something more so we can get this over the line. What do you say though? Because I know that's a myth, but how do we, as a sales team, how do we take it from and how do we lift it from what is perceived to be this tactical procurement base? You need to, sharpen your pencil by X amount. How do we lift this up when I'm not necessarily having the opportunity to talk to more strategic people because everything seems to be funneled back to, no, you've got to talk to me because I'm head of the procurement team and everything has to be managed in that way.
Well, first of all, a well-run procurement team inside an organization with discipline um, is going to be able to do what you just said, especially during the cycle of business awards. So if you wait until
Yeah.
then, you're going to have a problem. And if you don't have any other inputs to the organization and you've just been shipping them product, well, then you probably are just a tactical supplier. And frankly, um, shame on the selling organization for letting it get to that point. But let's say you find yourself at that point through no fault of your own. You just took over the account, procurement people swapped out, or procurement hired, one of the big consultancies to come in and do several waves of RFPs. The first thing is know yourself. Get on page with your management team before that you get too deep into that RFP process to find out what your BATNA, your best alternative to negotiate agreement, what your walkaway positions are, where
Yeah.
are you willing to give, and do you have any other carrots, and do you have any sticks? You really need to explore that. So when procurement, and if this is their goal, is to make it seem like it's only about widgets and dollars. When they break it down to widgets and dollars, then give them the widgets for dollars that if the rest of the relationship were easy instead of the difficulty that we all know all customers bring to the table, that if it's easy and you're going to give us the right lead time, the right MOQs, you're going to pick up from our doc, et cetera, then here's the low price. And then you got to caveat that with the rest of the story. A lot of those RFP tools don't really allow you to do that. They're
Mm.
fancy Excel spreadsheets or databases with some comparison capabilities on the back end. Um, but that tactic of give them what they're asking for, but caveat that there's always a place to add comments, or sometimes a customer will push, thou shalt sign this master agreement through the tool in order to participate. Well, you put a caveat in there that we need to discuss, that we need to redline.
Yeah.
And I got to tell you, there will be situations where despite all of that, it's going to come down to a price game. Well, then if you want to play in that scenario, then you do need to play the price game within reason.
Mm.
But I would caution sales teams to go to the bottom line too quickly. Um, just don't do that, because that procurement team is almost always going to come back to you. Like unless it's public sector and all tenders are due and it's going to be open and there's some regulatory agency, private businesses don't have that problem. They're going to come back. There's typically going to be another opportunity.
Yeah. And the thing with that is if you go in and offer lowball pricing, and I've seen companies do this, where we're going to go in really low, and if we can get a 3 or 4 or 5 year agreement, maybe a longer term agreement, we should be able to recoup some of that, I guess, lost revenue opportunity in the front end over the course of the relationship. What's your take on that? Because I've seen that absolutely become disastrous for many organizations because they've set a precedent at the beginning of that relationship where they've gone in really, really low, thinking that we'll literally buy this business. But our strategy then is to recoup some profitability over the duration of the relationship and hopefully increase our value and therefore the relationship as we go through. But that organization that we're doing business with is saying, no, we're just looking at the cheapest price. So there's no way to actually recoup that price because now you've set a benchmark and that's the minimum standard.
Well, it's well said. And you mentioned the word hope. I started smiling. I'll give you the PG version of an old South Carolina expression, which is you can hope in one hand and pour water into the other and see which one fills up first. Um, so you're right. It is dangerous. If a selling organization is going to take that tactic, then you better know the customer. And is this a tactical, fungible good type of widget where it just is widgets for dollars? Okay, it still might be worthwhile. But what can your procurement team do?
Mm.
Is the expanded volume going to give your procurement team breaks? And if you haven't had that conversation until the RFP started, then you've got an opportunity through cross-functional collaboration to do better. But your procurement team needs to be able to tell you, like, for that strategy to be something other than hope, yes, you give me an extra 10 widgets per year, then I've got a price break that will enable us to capture some margin back. And so we know we're going to lower price, but there's a clear path that procurement and the CFO both agree is there. So
Yeah.
that's one particular angle. Another particular angle is, uh, are there going to be engineering changes or scope changes? Are there going to be other opportunities to sell higher value services down the road?
Mm.
If yes, then that strategy is not such a hope oriented strategy. But I got to tell you, if you don't have procurement telling you, yes, I can get something from our supply base, if you don't have manufacturing telling you, yes, we just brought in this new machine, we're getting it tuned in, we've got a glide path to hitting it, and the COO and CFO both agree to that. Like, if you don't have concrete plans like this, and there's no other way to add value down the line and increase cost, then you better look at it for what it is. It's widgets for dollars, and we better expect that the margin on that deal is as good as it's going to get.
Yeah.
Because guess what? If you're playing in that space, there's going to be an RFP next year too.
Yeah, exactly right. Which comes back to what you mentioned before in terms of before you go into this, and even as part of your pricing strategy before you actually submit your pricing is know what your batten is going to be and try to understand is where is the zone of the possible agreement that might exist
Right.
within this to say, you know what, and it also comes down to what you value your own product, your own service at as well, and don't reduce that, right? Hold true to that and say, well, you know what, we're not going to lower our price if I'm prepared to walk away if you think this is a commodity price or commodity service. So if that's the case, then maybe we're not the best match for you, and having the courage to walk away from that. But to go into it with the pressure of no, we've got to get the deal at all costs on the hope that we'll recoup that over the course of the agreement is fraught with danger, as you quite rightly alluded to.
It is, and Darren, you just touched on, typically will cause a knot to form in a procurement person's stomach, which is, that pitch of, if it's just basically, if it's just dollars for widgets, then we're not the right partner, we're going to walk away. No
Yeah.
procurement person wants to hear that, and they don't want to hear that for a couple of reasons. Either they weren't serious about you and they were hoping you were going to be the rabbit that their current big dog is going to chase around the track, and all you were going to do is lower your competitor's margin, which, there may be something to that. But if they weren't going to consider you anyway, then they're about to lose their rabbit. If they were relying on you, or they really needed you to solve a service problem or an R&D problem or whatever other type of problem, suddenly panic sets in. They're going to break out into a cold sweat, and they're going to hear yeah, but hang on, why don't you go ahead? Maybe there's more. You're going to hear some hedging come across almost immediately. And so I would suggest to your listeners that are secure in their sales position and they've got some opportunity, play the game you and I are just talking about right now. Use that particular tactic, and then listen
Mm.
to what the buyer says.
Yeah, absolutely. Which brings me to the point of, I guess that, and we kind of touched on it before in terms of David and Goliath. I'm sure there's a lot of people out there who are working for organizations and they're looking for that big fish, that big whale, and thinking, you know what, I'd love to get a General Motors, or I'd love to get a Starbucks, I'd love to get Amazon on my books, etc., etc. And we'll do whatever it takes to try and do that. Um, One of the myths you often talk about is the fact that negotiations with big organizations, the Fortune 150s, the Fortune 100s, can be brutal, and that you need a big team in order to be able to do that effectively. What do you say to organizations that perhaps are punching above their weight or wanting to punch above their weight in terms of whether it's the mindset or the strategies or the tactics that they can play that game, they can actually provide value, and they can hold the line and negotiate with these bigger organizations who might outnumber them in terms of their negotiating teams on a 1 to 5, 1 to 10?
First of all, the number of people inside the David selling to the Goliath, it doesn't need to be a big number, but the unity, the collaboration, and the single sense of purpose and aware of BATNA, of ZOPA. What can procurement do? What about operations? What are our lead times? What's our fulfillment strategy? If the selling negotiating team has that really buttoned up, A, that'll make you a rare selling team, but B, it will impress to the nth degree that buying organization, and it will position it will, and you'll be in a much better position with a much more coherent and cohesive pitch than, frankly, your bigger competitors, because they haven't done it. It's hard to get all the kittens into one box, to bring ops and procurement, et cetera, together, and get everyone on the same page on how we're going to do this. So the David can play with the Goliath. However, the David needs to be careful as to what they wish for, what they
Mm.
ask for. And so I would recommend that the David go for, as a first step, a piece of business. So my anecdote from earlier, go for one distribution center, make it a small one.
Yeah.
Let us prove ourselves to you in that one. And then we can talk about scaling. Speak the language of the buyers. We can help you de-risk your supply chain by
Yeah.
having another point of redundancy and essentially be that rabbit that helps you, Mr. Buyer, keep your bigger supplier honest because we're going to blow you away with our service capability. And so if you're able to have that unity, take a small chunk and absolutely crush it when you get the business, that's the way to do it. And I'm going to pause there, but I do want to come back to kind of the cautionary tale of the David that caught the Goliath or the dog that caught the bus. But before I do that, let me pause so we can finish off this thread if you'd like.
No, I think it's a good strategy because sometimes when you look at a Goliath organization, you think we all want those big brands, the big iconic labels, because it's gonna elevate our credibility in the marketplace and it's great market education in terms of credibility. But I think your approach of not trying to bite off too much and it's knowing your capabilities and knowing what's possible and probably more importantly, playing the longer game rather than trying to get everything at once, right? Because you could be overwhelmed and you might think you've got the capabilities, but you will be tested. And not all deals and implementation of deals, very rarely do they go smoothly. There's always going to be something that you haven't considered, or there'll be some sort of challenge that is brought to bear. And if you've taken a big chunk of business, your ability to then transition becomes really challenging because essentially a smaller organization will have a higher percentage of their people allocated to that particular
Right.
implementation, which is placing pressure on for everybody. So I think that strategy is a really good one.
Well, and heaven forbid you bought the business.
Mm,
You're the dog that caught the bus, and suddenly you get way more volume than you can handle. And then, oh, by the way, they modify or cancel or push out their purchase orders within lead time. So you're sitting with 3 months instead of 2 weeks of finished goods inventory on the back on end of your factory, and on the front end of your factory, you've got 6 months of inventory piling up.
mm,
That can easily happen to you. I'll
mm,
tell you from having worked for some of the biggest companies in the industries that I've worked in, they are high touch, high maintenance companies. And so, if since we talked having started this podcast having some fun with our shared musical history, I'll bounce to a musician that's certainly popular these days, even if they're not on my Spotify list at number one. Imagine yourself, you're a young man, you're a supplier, and you want to go out on a date with a girl. There's the girl next door, and there's Taylor Swift. Who do you think has bigger expectations about dinner, about which plane we take, about the hotel, about all these other things? It's going to be the superstar. It's going to be the sexy brand. Make sure you know what you're getting into. And
mm.
I can tell you, if these last couple of companies I've worked for, there are lots of demands, and demands will come out of the woodwork, and they'll surprise the buying teams, who will then call you up and say, "Hey, you know that packaging redesign we just worked on? Well, scrap all that; it's got to be changed." And you and your sales and your procurement team will say, "We just bought $300,000 packaging for you because you told us verbally that was going to happen, and now
Yeah.
you want us to change. Are you going to pay us back for that?" "Oh, well, we never finalized that in writing." Oh, I mean, that sort of thing happens, and it may not be bad faith. It's just big organizations have a lot of complexity going on that your buyer is not aware of, and it will bite suppliers. So you better have the heft as a supplying organization to deal with chaos, because it's going to come.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Going out with the girl next door or Taylor Swift. I know that if I asked my daughters that question, it'd be, oh, Taylor Swift every single moment of the day.
So ask your wife, you'll get a better answer.
Well, yeah, I mean, both my girls went to Taylor Swift when she was in Australia, and they were devastated when they first missed out on tickets. But some miracle happened, and they found tickets, which
Yeah.
was fantastic. So, Jonathan, as we sort of bring this into for a landing, what are some other key, I guess, myths that we should be aware of from a selling perspective when dealing with buyers that perhaps we haven't covered yet?
It's the bit that Fortune 150 negotiations are brutal. They can be brutal, but I'll tell you, you'll the vast majority, I'd say 90% of the words on a contract, and therefore the actual ongoing business relationship, are things that you can work through if you know yourself. You got the cross-functional leaders in a team, you got a proper deal team put together, then price, commodity, risk management, currency, MOQs, lead time, blah, blah, blah. All that stuff, and you can process through it. No, it's going to take a long time, typically, because the buyer has a lot to do, and they're not paid on the deal. They're paid for showing up and working. So their motivation and their work ethic probably is going to be different than a salesperson's work ethic. And so that's the vast majority of the words on paper. And what I just touched on covers how the relationship will truly run over time. I'll tell you where it will be brutal. On the key terms in a master agreement, like reps and warranty, limitation liability, probably IP. There may be a couple of other points in there, but those are the typical things where when deals break down, they break down on those things. And that's where it's really important to have your CFO and your counsel, internal or external, and your CEO on the same board on board with what type of risk are we willing to take. And you got to be willing to say no. And so, yet those conversations are going to be hard, but the entirety of the negotiation, it's going to take a long time, but it won't be hard if you've brought the team together.
And the key part about that is, and I see this unfortunately happen a lot, they're not prepared enough. They haven't clearly identified what their key outcome is, and they haven't sat down with their counterparts in the buying organization and mapped out together what is the intention of this, right? So getting really crystal clear on what our overarching intention is. Because what I want to hear from a buyer's perspective is, do you have an intention of doing a deal? Do you have an intention of wanting to work with us, and what does that look like? So we can establish that. There almost becomes like a framework and a set of ground rules that we can then use to actually to have the negotiation moving forward. A lot of them just go straight into the negotiation, and they want to do the protection of their margins, their profitability, their supply chain, all that sort of stuff. So it becomes win-lose versus, and it doesn't necessarily have to be win-win, but we need to understand, what does a win look like for the buying organization? What is their intention here? And does that match what we're looking for? Because it may well be that you've done all the due diligence. You may have actually had the expression of interest turned into a letter of intent, and now the negotiation starts. But you might end up through the negotiation working out, you know what, this is actually not a good deal. So the preparation part has to be really, really key.
You summarized that very, very well and professionally. I'll give you a couple of quips to maybe take away. One, we've all heard fools rush in. Also tell you that amateurs talk price first.
Yeah.
And so keep those things in mind. Get that alignment. Do that preparation, and the deal will be much better. And frankly, you'll get the deals you want, and that can be successful over time.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely brilliant. So, mate, fabulous conversation. You've shared so much gold from certainly your experience in strategic sourcing, but now working with organizations to help them buy and sell better. For people that are listening to this, want to know more about the famous Jonathan Gardner from Charleston, South Carolina, but also more about what you do, where's the best place for them to connect with you and learn a little bit more about you?
Well, a couple of ways. First, you can check out my website, which is www.jgardnergroup.com, or you can send me an email at jonathan@jgardnergroup.com.
Awesome. And I might even suggest you've got a LinkedIn profile as well. So maybe.
Oh, well said. Yes. I'm still learning this bit about technology and headphones and LinkedIn. So pardon me for that.
And Bluetooth.
Oh, gosh. Bluetooth. Who knew?
Well, I'll put those in the show notes. Jonathan, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast. And my friend, keep up the great work, and all the best as you continue to expand the J Gardner Group Executive Advisory into a global sensation.
Well, hey, we're global now because we're on both sides of the globe at the same time. Thank you so much, Darren.
All the best, mate. Thank you for listening to the Exceptional Sales Leader Podcast. I trust the information in this episode has been helpful in your journey towards becoming exceptional. And remember, please take the time to rate the show, subscribe to the show so other people can find it, but also if I can help you, jump on my calendar, go to leadwithdarren.com and let's have a conversation about how I can help you along your journey to being exceptional.